Just to give you guys an idea how big the cowl is on this 86-inch Zero. Welcome back, everybody. Thanks for joining me again down here in the lair. It is Brendan from Just Plain Crazy, and we are digging into this giant scale A6M Zero. The build officially starts now. Let's get right to it. We have what is going to be our first couple steps laid out here on the bench. Again, protective cloth down so we don't damage any of this covering or start to put indents into the wood. That would be unsightly. We've gone through our build manual and we know what the first couple steps are, and they are very, very similar to that of the Texan 2 that we built in the last series. We have our heating irons out. We have our regular size heating iron, and we have our small foot heating iron. We've already kind of sectioned out our hardware into little bins. Got our tweezers to make it accessible. We're going to need a small fine drill bit. We got our thin CA, and we have started to assemble our hinges. I can already tell you I'm pretty happy with this one compared to the last one because everything I needed is included in there. Now they do give you some pretty stout looking Phillips head screws. I am not going to use those still. I am going to use the ball driver, these Allen head little screws. I like those a lot better. I think that they're cleaner, but they're also pretty strip free. So that's okay. That's an upgrade. That's what we do to ARFs. Again, the hinges need to be assembled before we start to throw them in the wing. You're going to use silicone tubing, which they also included in the kit this time that was missing before for us. So that's a nice little step up there. When it comes down to these hinges, couple quick notes. We want to make sure they already pre-drilled 3 holes for you. We want to make sure that that hinge falls on this hinge line right there as we do that. If you put them on backwards, they'll still fit, but you're not going to have the right hinge spacing right there, and you're going to see that the pivot is not on top of there. As we put those in, we want to make sure that our spacing stays all the way around in our flaps. So the next step beyond that, we want to make sure that this covering is all nice and pressed down. We have to cut out the pockets here for the retract gear. So we want to make sure we take the heating irons and we take the time now to get all the wrinkles out, whether it's in the ailerons, the flaps, or the wing panels. So we have quite a bit of ironing here to do just to make sure that it stays, you know, pretty wrinkle free for us. And one word of advice, if you get the white stuff really hot, I'm sure it's going to turn brown. So try not to take too much heat to this, but just enough to really kind of press it down in the wood. Time to get going. As you put in the hinges, remember you want to drill, you want to tap it, all the holes with a screw, then you want to apply CA in all of those and let them harden up, and now you can go ahead and install the hinge. Here you can see that our flap surface is all installed on the first wing and ready to go. Now we're getting the aileron set in place. One of the tricks that you're going to use here is simply to place one, I like to use at times 2 T-pins, so that way that you know that that fiberglass hinge is perfectly centered into that surface. That way it can't move. Once we go ahead and install this aileron into place for a rough fit, we're going to make sure that all of our hinge gapping is right on both sides and even, and then also there on the hinge line itself. You usually want a 1/16 or less, so some people like to leave the T-pins in. Sometimes I do, sometimes I don't. Once they're placed into there and I know that everything is centered, sometimes I will pull them out, or sometimes I will use them as a guide to wick some of the CA right down into that hinge. But either way, we're going to go ahead and get those things installed. Let's get to it. Now that the aileron is hinged, we're going to move on to servo installation for both the flap surface and the aileron. One thing to note, be careful you don't install this upside down. It is possible to do. You also want to make sure that your hole for the horn is facing in the down location. I'm going to choose to skip this step and move on because I want to come back and do the horns for both wings at the same time. You'll notice that we do have pull strings here for fishing wiring through. I'm going to leave those there. I'm going to install the servos for now, but I make my own custom lead, so everything is the perfect length from here all the way into the plane. But I removed the covers and we're going to be installing two different servos in this plane. So the King Max are a very good economic base servo. I'm going to install the 5514s for the flap surfaces. Those things will have 186 inch-ounces of torque. And then I'm going to install the King Max 5325s for all of my flight control surfaces, meaning rudder, elevator, and aileron. These things are putting out 368 inch-ounces of torque on the 7.4 application. So when we do this, it looks like they've already gone ahead and CA'd all of our holes for us. Those all look to be hardened at this time. When we put that servo in there and mount it, I am just going to use a drill bit and drill a small pilot hole through there so I don't crack those. Don't force screws in there because you'll wind up cracking them. When it comes down to the light, I noticed that there is no lead wire to install these lights, so you're going to have to use a metal piano wire. Be careful you don't poke holes in the covering, and actually fish that wire through where I can mate it up with this one and then go the rest of the way through the wing. Now these are set for, by the directions, 12 volts. They will be good for up to 12 volts, so you don't have to worry about burning those up. When it comes down to it though, we're going to just simply glue these in with canopy glue, and we're going to go ahead and glue that lens assembly on as well with just canopy glue. Make sure you clean the inside of that canopy so you don't have any fingerprints on it when you glue it into place, and then we'll just let it adhere with tape overnight. The one lesson I've learned about canopy glue over the years: less is more. Too much will take forever to dry, and it will actually dry fairly thick. I don't like CA on the Lexan stuff because it tends to fog it, and I don't like the way that appearance looks. So no drawstring here, drawstrings there. Let's get all that stuff put together. You want to make sure that you iron down the cover on all of these hatch assemblies. I take a T-pin and I'll go through the backside just to poke holes to make it easier to find that location now from the top side. Once I do that, I'll go around again all the edges with a heating iron to make sure that none of that surface comes up. And in here, I will do the same thing, taking a heating iron around those edges. Make sure that before you go ahead and install this thing that you apply a little bit of thin CA on those tabs so it really wicks in and hardens those. You don't want those things to pull out because the whole servo will be mounted into those covers, nor do you want those to break. So again, pilot holes, drill, screw, take it out, harden them, and then back in. All right. Here's a quick way to add a really nice touch to your LED lighting and to actually help it be a little bit brighter and make it stand out. This is actually like an aluminum ducting tape. It's not duct tape. But anyway, all you have to do is go ahead and line this, smooth it out to the best of your ability. We made sure that we used alcohol and cleaned off the inside so we got no grimy fingerprints and it adheres well as clean the outsides here with alcohol. And finally, we're going to dress it up with some canopy glue. A little bit goes a long way. Tack it fast with the tape. When it comes down to cutting your wheel openings, there's a couple ways to do this. Number one, we want to make sure that we use our heating iron again to make sure that that covering is pressed down all the way around that opening, so that way it doesn't come loose or pop up and then create a bunch of wrinkles for us. The other tip we're going to make sure that we have as new as possible, or brand new number 11 blade here on the end. And when you go to do this, there's a couple ways. Number one, you can kind of heat the covering a little bit with a gun and push that stuff down, make it saggy, so then you can go ahead and trim around it and you know that you've used that pressure in your favor. Or you can just go ahead and simply cut right around the inside and then work with it and try and roll it over after the fact. Or you can simply cut some X's into the corners. We want to try and save a little bit of this fabric in case we ever have to do a patch repair or anything like that. But one of the other things is you can actually just trim right along the edges if you want, because these wheel pockets that are going to go in the inside of there will actually seal under those edges. But I would still always prefer to roll the edges and seal against the wood. That way we prevent any type of gas or oil or any of that other stuff soaking into the wood, because we have sealed edges. And then when we glue these pockets down, there'll be canopy glue underneath there as well. But let's go ahead and get into the time lapse. I'm going to heat mine up and try and stretch it, push it down, see if I can get some heat to start rolling those over before I cut it. Our retract is mounted in there. You can see we used our customized colored hardware. The JP retracts are mounted in there. We have our wheel cup assembly trimmed out, and that's ready to go in. You can see what we did here with the covering, and we were able to wrap that covering around and kind of tuck it under the edge here all the way around and then into those areas as well, so that way they're protected from fuel and oil. And then what we are going to do is apply a very slight amount of canopy glue right around that edge, and we're going to seal that down and leave some weight on it overnight so that assembly is completely cured and clean. We're going to go ahead and put this underneath before we go ahead and do that, and then make sure that it's secured and that nothing here is going to rub and cause me issues as far as wire chafing. So let's get into the last part of our time lapse. There we have the weights in it. We have everything taped down using blue painter's tape because it is a little bit more aggressive. Don't have to worry about peeling paint off the foam here. We're going to go ahead and let this dry overnight. See you guys tomorrow. So you can see here, we got our cup all glued in. That turned out really, really nice. Looks really clean, like the way that turned out. If you needed to, you could go ahead and drill some screws, holes, and put in some small screws. Again, if you're going to do that, you have to harden the wood underneath. There you get an idea of how our lens assembly turned out. That looks amazing, and also the canopy glue there is dried, turned out really good. In this step, what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and install the wheels into the retracts. This axle, I flattened the spot on the axle where this grub screw is going to go against it there, and we use some blue Loctite. And then we've gone ahead and filed down this side of the axle shaft so we have something to tighten against there. And I've used hot glue, I've used silicone tubing over the end of this, but one of the other tricks that I actually use here on the end of the axle is actually you can just take a little dab of canopy glue and put it under that collar and tighten it down. And once you tighten that down, that'll give that thing a nice vibration-free kind of coating underneath, so those wheel collars don't come off and you don't wind up losing a wheel. But anyway, those things look really cool. Those retracts are awesome. Let's get to it. It's time to go ahead and get these wheel pant covers on, or wheel pants, or wheel shields, or axle covers, whatever you want to call these things. It's time to install them. One of the things that you want to note is you want to actually slide that wheel collar on the inside all the way in. You want this wheel to come inset a good bit. Now, I thought about cheating and getting a little bit more width for stability on the tires. Believe it or not, a 1/4 inch is really a big deal when it comes down to stability in a warbird. But with that being said, I can't pull these wheels out because once you put these shields on here, the tire would rub. So in order to get that clearance in there, we actually had to slide that in all the way, which isn't a big deal. I'm sure it's made to be that way. This cover will actually rest against the outer end of the axle, and that's with this end of the axle flush on the inside. They have 6 holes for you to poke here in the covering so you can install the given button head screws. Now these are metric button head screws. They give you black ones. I prefer to use the stainless ones, especially if they get moisture on them. I don't want them to rust. And again, as we install these, they give you the placement where this stuff should go spacing wise, but you're going to have to find the overall depth just so this thing doesn't bind as it's retracted. You don't want it to hit the wing here. We're going to go ahead and use a little blue Loctite on all those screws so they don't come out. We're going to get our positioning right. We're going to tighten this down. So it is time to get to wing number 2. Everything that we just did, we are going to repeat on this wing. The first one turned out phenomenal. Super happy with it. Let's get going. Now that our wings are complete, it's time to go ahead and get our control horns set into place. Something to note here about your control horns, it's very important to make sure you get the right lengths. Although the manual specifies it, it doesn't really specify it. You're going to notice the ailerons, your rudder, and your elevator all use the short shank horns. The flaps are going to use these long-seated horns to actually go down into those slots. So make sure you pay attention and you get the right ones in place. We're also going to be applying some tape to center this aileron into its place and hold it securely. And on this model, I am going to use a laser to actually run right down the seam of that thing and align that control horn point. And the reason that we're going to align that control horn point is you don't want the symmetry of the move to change from going this direction to this direction. So when you get a neutral flying airplane in both flap directions, that's going to come from that hinge point being perfect right there. You're getting better resolution or even resolution out of each side of that movement. In order to do this, we're going to go ahead and take our sanding bar here and simply shave down everywhere that's going to be epoxied into place. Then we're going to use some of our, again, slow cure epoxy. We use the high sol here that was recommended to me a while ago by my buddy Ronnie, and I fell in love with it ever since. But we want to make sure all those horns stay in place and that we have a little bit of time to work with them to line everything up, but we definitely want to make sure they get on the hinge line. So again, make sure the long ones go in the flaps, the short one and everything else. But let's go ahead and get back into this build and get to it. Now it's time, guys, we're going to go ahead and epoxy in all of our control horns. Again, using high sol slow cure epoxy so I have time to mix and play. I like using lids here. We'll retract that back so it doesn't get ruined. We'll clean that off then and recap it. And we definitely want to make sure here that we get a nice amount and a nice coating of epoxy down in that hole. And then once we have all of these glued in, we'll go ahead and set them all with the laser. And I think we're good. Now, let's position these, and I am going to use a laser, and we're going to literally go right down the hinge line. And as I look at this from above, I can just literally follow it point to point. And this one needs to be set back. A good bit. Okay, good. We'll come over here to this one. Just a hair forward on that one. Good. Nice, almost spot on. And the nice part about using the laser this way is you can literally follow it from either side. Either side is acceptable. And basically we're just trying to get a check. So get this one back just a little bit. Perfect. Right there. Love it. All right, guys, and there you have it. We're going to let this cure about a half an hour. We're going to peel the tape, and then we're going to let it sit overnight. See you tomorrow. All right, guys, what do you say we finish up getting these wings done? I really want to get these done and move on to the fuselage. One thing I want you to note is the pushrod length for the flaps and the ailerons. They specify 75 mil. All four of them that come in the pack are all 75 mil. I'm not exactly sure what they're getting at here with this measurement, because if you run the clevis to the edge of each rod, they're all roughly 75 millimeters. That's fine, but if you're going to use that as a final adjusted length, it doesn't work and is inaccurate, because if you thread that clevis down, the threaded rod to threaded rod is still 75 millimeters. So I'm going to shoot for mine initially to be the clevises lined up right here at the end. The other thing that I've noticed is that there isn't fuel tubing in the package for both these, and remember we used it over here the last time. So I just need to cut myself some more fuel tubing to make sure that I have enough here and there. I do not want those just left as they are. We want that pressure on those to hold them together as well. Now when it comes down to installing the linkage into the servos, we're going to use our super handy dandy cheap servo centering tool. especially for the ailerons. Now, these are not programmable King Max servos. They are just standard digital ones, so wherever center is. We can sub-trim tune that out with our radio, but I want that on the neutral position to be as close as I possibly can here, and we'll adjust our linkage, and because where we set our horn, then we should get equal throw both ways once we do the final radio tune. Now down here, when it comes down to the flaps, remember, you're going to center this thing, and then you are going to use your dial in the manual mode to go to the far direction. You want to start here so you have all of the travel back to center and then all of the travel the other way to really get a good amount of flap deflection. And if I remember right, these things are almost 70 millimeters. So that's pretty close to that horn hitting that wing. There's a lot of deflection. This is a big bird to slow down with these flaps, and it generates some more lift. So we want to make sure that the clevis isn't smashed down against the wood, but also that we're getting as much travel in there as we possibly can. So the last tidbit I have for you guys is make sure whenever you're doing servo testing with these servo testers and you're centering them and stuff, make sure you know whether or not they're 6 volt or 7.2 high voltage servos, and make sure you're using the right pack. Remember, we're not testing speed here, so you can never go wrong with a 6 volt pack. And that may not have been true 20 years ago, but today you'll be fine with a 6 volt nickel metal hydride pack. But anyway, let's get into that, and then the last portion is we're going to fish wires through. We'll eventually, let me pull this wing down, make wires for this thing, a harness coming through. I have my retract wire that I'm going to have to make a hole and fish into the other side, and then we are going to use bulk connectors that will come up out of here, and I think I'm going to maybe 3D print something that's going to maybe even fill that plug that would hold my 12 pin, so that way that's cleaned up a little bit. But anyway, let's get back into finishing these wings, shall we? So a couple things here. Number one, expanding hemostats are your best friend when it comes down to putting on fuel tubing. I can simply cut a piece and stretch it, slide it over that linkage onto the spot I need, and pull it off. Yes, you can do it by hand, and yes, I get that. But it just makes it nice when you can slide it over the end here, especially when we get into doing this for the fuel tank. I'll show you how I utilize those pieces for clamps, and it dresses it up, makes it look nicer. Now let's talk about set screws here for servos, for the arms. Number one, I put locking washers under the King Max ones. They did not come with locking washers. Most likely wouldn't need them, but I feel better with locking washers. Why don't I like to use Loctite on that screw? Number one, because you don't always know. If you researched it, you would, but you don't always know, and God forbid you assume wrong. You put Loctite on the threads of that screw and it's a plastic gear in there and not a metal one. Then what happens is you wind up melting the gears. So I just use a lock washer there on the screw, and then just like when they build production items, production cars, one of the things that I will do is when you put nuts and bolts together, you paint mark them. So I do something similar with all the pieces that I can't see. I just use a dab of hot glue over that screw to that arm, and that thing will never come loose. But what that tells me later down the road when I'm eyeballing this before the maiden, if you see hot glue on there, I know I tightened that surface, I checked that surface, and that surface was sealed so it won't vibrate loose. Now when I put it in there, I don't have to worry about this thing ever. And that wraps up, guys, part one. Do me a favor, if you liked it, make sure you give me a thumbs up. It helps the channel out a lot. If you have any questions with any type of balsa ARFs, feel free to leave them in the comment section down below. Like, share, subscribe, and hit that bell notification and select all. Especially if you like this build series and have interest in this plane or any other balsa ARFs, all of this material will transfer from one to the other. So if you select that bell notification, you'll get made aware of all of my content when it comes out, especially more on the build series of this 86-inch giant scale Zero. I especially can't wait to get into installing the EME60 with auto start function on this. Again, it's a Seagull Models that I picked up over at Gator-Rc, so you can go over and check them out if you're interested in this balsa ARFs or any other warbirds or everyday balsa ARF flyers. They have a huge selection. Check them out over at www.gator-rc.com. Links are all down in the description below for this plane and their website. But with that being said, I wish you guys happy flights. Peace out.